All right, so here on the outline you'll see we're going to be in chapter 11 and 12 of Mark tonight. And to orient us kind of where we left off, if you'll recall, if you were here for our last class, where we left off, Jesus was in Jericho, and this is where he had encountered Bartimaeus, who was notably blind and begging on the side of the road. And so we talked about that story last time. And so there he was. He had traveled down from Galilee to Jericho on his way to Jerusalem, where he's been telling his disciples and the apostles that he's going there to be handed over and arrested and put to death, where he will then rise again. So we're picking up here in chapter 11. They have traveled from Jerusalem to Jericho. Interesting thing about the geography there, you can sort of tell on this map. It's not topographical, but Jericho is very low. In fact, it's one of the lowest cities on the planet. It's below sea level, and Jerusalem is several thousand feet above that. So it's quite a hike and a relatively short distance up to Jerusalem. So when you hear in the Bible about going up to Jerusalem, oftentimes they're talking about ascending, going up a road or a trail to Jerusalem. And so that's where we pick up with the triumphal entry in chapter 11. And I want to note about this event here that we learn in chapter 11 that this is happening at Passover time, right? This is when the crucifixion is going to happen. So it's Passover time. Pilgrims are going to Jerusalem to be there for Passover. That's happening at this same time that Jesus is traveling there. And the triumphal entry, the thing I want to emphasize about it in the relatively short time we have to talk about it tonight, is that Jesus has done many things throughout our study of Mark that should be interpreted symbolically. This one, I think, is very obvious. And so as we know from the story, Jesus tells his disciples, he tells them to go out. Mark says he tells them to go out and get a colt. We know from the other accounts what this is it's a colt that's a donkey. And Jesus is going to ride the donkey as he goes to Jerusalem. People are going to lay down leaves. These are thought to be palm leaves. That's the account we get here. But what I want to call to your attention is this is very obviously, I think, an allusion to Zechariah chapter 9, which is a messianic prophecy. There's a lot of parallels in what happens. So we read here in Mark's account, it says, here we have, he's talking about going into the village where they'll find a colt. It says, they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut from the fields. And those who went before and those who followed were shouting, Hosanna, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now this part is right out of Psalm 118, which is a typical psalm that pilgrims would probably be singing on their way to Jerusalem, on their way to the temple. Also a set of psalms that were probably sung around the Passover time. So this is all happening as he's proceeding, as his procession is going into Jerusalem. It says here, blessed is the coming kingdom of our father David, Hosanna in the highest. But there's a very obvious parallel, again, to Zechariah chapter 9. So I just want you to notice in Zechariah 9 through 11, it says, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. Righteous and having salvation is he, humble and mounted on a donkey, the colt, the foal of a donkey. He shall speak peace to the nations. His rules shall be from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. All right, so this talks about Jerusalem welcoming their king. Now, there's a difference in this king. Zechariah actually is himself, I think, quoting from Psalm 72, when it says, may he have dominion from sea to sea and from rivers to the ends of the earth. Another verse in Psalm 72 says, may all kings fall down before him, all nations serve him. So this is not just the king of Israel. Remember the land that was promised to Israel, it didn't extend this far. This is seemingly limitless. It's from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. In other words, Jesus is King of Kings, I think is the message here of the prophets, the message of what God is doing. And so I just want you to have in mind that Jesus is quite likely being intentionally symbolic here. He knows what he's proclaiming. All of this is following on the heels of Mark chapter 8, when his disciples have confessed, they've admitted he is the Messiah. He is God's Messiah. He is Israel's king, in other words. And so that's going to lead us, if you look after this triumphal entry in verse 11, so what do they do once they get here? Once sort of Israel has welcomed its king, it says in verse 11, he entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So he goes into Jerusalem and he immediately goes into the temple. Probably wasn't that unusual for people going to Jerusalem. So here, this is a photo you've probably seen of a model of the Holy City. This fairly well-known and famous model. Nobody really knows exactly what the second temple looked like, what Herod's temple looked like. It's based on descriptions we have from the time, but of course we don't know exactly what it looked like. But this is a model of what it might look like. Josephus, in his book Wars, he talks about the temple. He says, it was covered all over with plates of gold of great weight. It had a lot of gold on it. In fact, it says it had so much gold that at the first rising of the sun reflected back a very fiery splendor and forced themselves to look upon it to turn their eyes away, just as they would have done at the sun's own rays. And then it talks about how white it was as well. It says that people, as they were coming up to Jerusalem from a distance, they could see the temple because it's tall. It's very, very tall. And so from a distance, it looked like a mountain covered with snow. For as those parts of it that were not gilt, they were exceeding white. Right? So it's very white, very gold. An interesting thing about what Josephus says, see these spikes up here at the top. Josephus actually talks about that too. Of course, he does. We don't know exactly what they look like, but it talks about the pointed triangles or spikes, and it says that those were installed to keep the birds off, which I kind of appreciate as a design aspect. So, but anyway, the temple, I think we know from history, it would have been right up there with any of the ancient wonders of the world to see. And so it was a sight to behold. But the temple is going to play a huge role in what Jesus is going to do here in chapter 11, in chapter 12, and in chapter 13. And I think it's very important for us to understand exactly what he's doing in the temple. All right, another important thing for us to understand is Jesus, as the Messiah, has authority over the temple. So here we can look back to a couple of Old Testament scriptures. 2 Samuel 7, 12 through 14. It says, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will to him be a father, and he shall be to me a son. Okay, so this goes back to the Davidic prophecy. God promised to David that he would set up a house under David. And here we see this relation between the one who builds the temple, Solomon, and the authority over the temple. We see the same here in Zechariah chapter 6. It says, and then say to him, thus says the Lord of hosts, behold the man whose name is the branch, for he shall branch out from his place, and he shall build the temple of the Lord. It is he who shall build the temple of the Lord, and shall bear royal honor, and shall sit and rule on his throne. Okay, so this is important because as Jesus goes into the temple, he, as the Messiah, or as the rightful king, he has authority over the temple. And so that's important for us to understand as well. And that's going to enlighten us into what I think, if you don't read it carefully, can be a very confusing passage in Mark. This is the story of Jesus cleansing the temple We pick up here in verse 12 of chapter 11 in Mark. But I think it's also important to note that there's another story that's told alongside this in Mark's account. And so Mark's also telling a story about Jesus in a fig tree. And on its face, if that's all you're reading is about Jesus in this fig tree, that can be confusing. I mean, let's look at it. Starting here in verse 12, it says, "On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. And when he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, 'May no one ever eat fruit from you again.' And his disciples heard it." All right, so this looks a little confusing. Jesus is going up to a fig tree. Mark's telling us it's spring. This isn't the time when figs have fruit. And Jesus not finding any fruit on it seems to curse it or pronounce judgment on it. Again, this looks confusing on its face, but what Mark is doing here is he has a story within a story. So we have the story of the fig tree, and in between, the story of Jesus in the temple. And a lot of people call this sort of story narrative structure a sandwich. Mark has done this other times. If you recall, when he healed Jairus' daughter, there was also the woman with the issue of blood. And that was a sandwich-style story, where the story about Jairus' daughter begins, he heals a woman with the issue of blood, and then we get back to Jairus' daughter. Same thing happens here. We have a fig tree sandwich. So the reason I bring that up is I think you can't interpret one of these stories without the other. They're codependent on each other. The interpretation, they mutually interpret each other. All right, so what do we find out about the fig here in verses 12 through 14? First of all, we find Jesus has come to it looking for fruit, and he doesn't find any. And then we have this odd saying at the end where he pronounces judgment on the fruit. He curses it. He says, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." Now he's going to go into the temple. And so this story about the fig tree is going to help us interpret what happens in the temple. So we get to the temple, and we get in verse 15, it says, "And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple and began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons, and he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, 'Is it not written, my house shall be called a prayer for all the nations? But you have made it a den of robbers.' And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city." All right, so Jesus goes into the temple. I've always heard this story described as Jesus cleansing the temple or chasing the money changers out, and that is what happens. But I think to interpret the full meaning of what Jesus is doing here, we have to look very carefully at what he says too. And so it's important to note that this thing he teaches them in verse 17, he says, "Is it not written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." He's quoting from two Old Testament prophets. He's combining them together in a single teaching. He's quoting right out of Isaiah 56, but also Jeremiah 7. So I think without looking at those passages beside this, we can't really interpret what Jesus is intending to do here. So these passages, they're key to interpreting Jesus' actions. So what do we find in Isaiah 56? If you'd like to turn to it, you can look at it. I don't know that I'll read it all. But what I'll say about the context is the context of what's happening in these verses in Isaiah 56, and he's quoting directly from verse 7 in Isaiah 56. The context here is a promise of restoration for Israel. It's a full return from exile for the people of Israel that God is promising through Isaiah. Another important thing to remember, though, is as you read on in Isaiah 56, there's also condemnation about Israel's leaders. So Isaiah is very critical of the leaders when you look in Isaiah 56, 9 through 12. And the other thing is, it says this verse that Jesus quotes, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples." Right? So it's envisioning or anticipating a time when other people would be called into God's kingdom, Gentiles. But then that Jesus doesn't stop there. He goes on and quotes from Jeremiah 7 as well. And so the quote in Jeremiah 7 is from verse 11. It says, "Has this house, which has been called by my name, become a den of robbers in your sight?" Well, the context in Jeremiah 7, if you read it all, and again, we don't have time, but I encourage you to read it on your own time. The context of Jeremiah 7 is a prophecy against Israel, and it's a prophecy specifically against the temple. And it's a prophecy of coming destruction. In fact, Jeremiah, later in his career, I think was even imprisoned for making this very prophecy. He was put into prison because he was prophesying against the temple. But here, Jesus is quoting from this prophecy against the temple in Jeremiah 7. And in the context here is that the temple will be destroyed. When you look at verses 14 and 15 of Jeremiah, it says, Jeremiah 7, it says, "Therefore, I will do to the house that is called by my name and in which you trust, and to the place that I give you and to your fathers, as I did to Shiloh." So God, through Isaiah, is saying, I will destroy my house. I will destroy the temple. And I will cast you out of my sight as I cast out all your kinsmen and all the offering of Ephraim. An interesting thing about this passage in Jeremiah 2 is if you continue to the next chapter in Jeremiah, chapter 8, figs pop up. Okay, so it's interesting. Jesus is talking about a fig tree. He invokes Jeremiah 7. When you read through this prophecy and you get down to Jeremiah 8, verse 13, God's saying, "When I would gather them, declares the Lord, there are no grapes on the vine, nor figs on the tree. Even the leaves are withered, and what I gave them has passed away from them." So God's lamenting that Israel hasn't produced fruit, and he's using the image of a fig tree with no figs. And we see this in Jeremiah 8. And so I think all of this is key to understanding what Jesus is doing here in the temple when he takes this action. I think I've always sort of heard this, it's easy to think about this story as well. Well, he has a problem with the commercialization of what's going on in the temple, the selling. And you sort of get that out of, a den of robbers. But I think it's more than that. I think when you look at the context of these quotes, especially the Jeremiah quotes, it speaks to more than just cleansing, right? So I think Jesus intended to symbolize, through this symbolic act that he's doing in the temple, he's talking about a prophecy of destruction of the temple. He's invoking the Old Testament prophets who prophesied the same thing last time the temple was destroyed. And I think that helps us understand what he's doing, and it's going to help us understand chapter 13 as well. So he's invoking the prophets. He's acting out judgment on this fig tree. He's noting that the fig tree, like the temple itself in Israel, have failed to produce the fruit that God intended. I think all of that is part of what we see here. I've said a lot. If you have, we'll take just a little bit of time if you have questions or comments, but otherwise we'll move on. Anybody have any comments? We can get the mic up here to Brother Whidden.
Yeah, it's not really a comment, it's more of a clarifying question. So what you've kind of portrayed here, is it maybe that Jesus is dealing with a symptom of a much greater disease, so to speak? In other words, they had gotten to the point where this kind of activity was going on in the temple courtyard, which he disdained and took action against, but it was really about more of a rotting from the core, of those that were in charge in Jerusalem. Is that a fair way to characterize it?
I think so.
Okay.
I think, in my opinion, it's clear from the text that part of the meaning of this is the temple itself had not produced the fruit that God expected of Israel. Mm-hmm. And Jesus is symbolically pronouncing that judgment upon it. If I veer out a little further into just my own opinion about maybe why the cleansing, why is he cleansing, why is he disrupting the money changing, or what is the effect of that? I don't want to speculate on why, but if you think about, well, what's the effect of actually what he does? I think about just the mechanics of how all this works, right? So he stops the money exchange temporarily for a short time, I assume, which then means if the right money is not obtained, then the worshipers can't purchase animals. And if they can't purchase animals, those animals can't be sacrificed. There's a sense in which he may have caused a temporary cessation of sacrifices in the temple. And we know what Jesus has come to Jerusalem to do is to be the sacrifice, right? Be the ultimate sacrifice, the sacrifice of all sacrifices. In fact, when we look forward to the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem in AD 70, we know that the sacrificial system ceases then. The sacrifices stop. And so is it symbolic of that? Maybe. I don't know. That's my thought on what it means. Scott?
Verifying, about to say, said that money changer selling these sacrifice had all set up. So effectively, what they were doing, they were blocking the Gentile God, which fits with your context about house of prayer for all. So in addition to stopping the sacrifices, because Jews are not fruit, also saying people because you're not producing, sending people who want to come to God and worship, do it.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. I agree with the premise of that's all part of Israel isn't living up to what it was intended to be by God as a blessing to all nations. And in fact, the word here that we read, a den of robbers, I understand it means like brigands or something like that, which is more like not robbers but bandits or rebels. And so they become a rebellious people. They've rebelled against God's intention for them. And in fact, they've sort of turned it, instead of being a blessing to all nations, they've got a bit of a nationalistic streak, maybe, even comparing themselves, one-upping themselves over the Gentiles or separating themselves in that way as they're superior or better. And when that wasn't what God intended of them at all. So those are my thoughts. We'll move along here. We get back to the fig tree in verse 20. And so they go back to the fig tree, and it says, and Peter remembered, and he said, Rabbi, look, this is verse 21. He says, the fig tree that you cursed has withered. And Jesus said to them, have faith. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes in what he says will come to pass, and it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you that whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. Here's another maybe difficult thing to understand. Is Jesus just talking about the strength of faith, and that if you have faith, anything is possible, even throwing a mountain into the sea? I think that's certainly a fair interpretation. What he might be alluding to, even though, is this might also be another reference to the temple. The temple was on the Temple Mount. It appeared as a mountain. I think a lot of what he's doing here is pronouncing judgment on the temple itself. That's ultimately going to be fulfilled in AD 70. But perhaps this is a reference even to throwing the temple into the sea. That Jesus has come to establish God's people to be the Israel that God intended them to be. He's bringing the kingdom. And there's a very real sense we know, particularly from the New Testament, that the temple today is Jesus, and it's the body of Christ. It's the church. So this could also be a reference to the temple when he's saying this here. I think we need to keep in mind that all of this in chapter 11, 12, and 13 is very temple-centric. All of these stories seem to have something to do with the temple. So we're going to pick up again in verses 27 through 33. So he goes back to the temple. And keep in mind what he just did with the cleansing of the temple, the chasing out the money changers. That's a big deal. I don't think we have an analog in the United States to how important the temple was to them. You would have to combine every significant, important building we have in the entire country all into one, and it probably still wouldn't be as meaningful as the temple was to the Jewish people. And so what Jesus did in there is going to, I think, directly lead to his arrest. It caused a lot of attention from the Jewish leadership, from the temple leadership, and so now they come to him and they ask him, by what authority do you have? And so it says, they said to him in verse 28, by what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority to do them? And Jesus says to them, I'll ask you one question, answer me, and I'll tell you by what authority I do these things. So he says, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? Answer me. And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why then did you not believe him? But if we say from man, they were afraid of the people, for they all knew that they held John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, we don't know. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. All right, so Jesus' counter question, it's not a question to stump them. I think it's a question to get to their true intent. They weren't really interested in finding out the answer to what Jesus asked them. What they're interested in doing is trapping Jesus, condemning him, leveling a charge against him. That's what they're doing. They're saying, well, who gave you the authority to do this? They're raising a question of Jesus' legal status. Who says you can do this? Are you an outlaw? But Jesus asked them about John's baptism, which is interesting. So I think there's a couple reasons why he would call attention to John's baptism when he's talking about his authority. One is, what do we know that John taught? John taught that the one following him, he was unworthy to even untie his sandals. So John was saying, someone even greater than me is coming. And if John was a prophet, if he's the last in the line of prophets, then who's coming next is even greater than a prophet. And so that establishes his authority. But he's also calling attention to John's baptism. Just keep in mind where our story in Mark started. Jesus was baptized by John, and when he was, the Spirit of God descended upon him like a dove, and there's a voice from heaven saying, this is my beloved Son, in whom I'm well pleased. Jesus was anointed. He was anointed Messiah at John's baptism. And so if John's message is from heaven, then Jesus really is the Messiah. He's the King. That's his authority right there. This was known about, the disciples were there to witness it. They remembered it. Peter writes about it years later in his epistle. Jesus is calling attention to this public event where he was anointed by the Father. But they're not interested in the answer. It says they say they don't know because they're afraid of the reaction either way. So I think this shows Jesus' mastery of the situation, but it also shows he knows his authority. He knows where it's from, and he knows that they should recognize it as well. So we will continue on here into chapter 12. So in chapter 12, Jesus begins to speak after this happens, and he says he begins to speak to them in parables, and he tells them this parable of the tenants. And so the parable's pretty simple. He says, a man planted a vineyard and put a fence around it and dug a pit for the winepress, and he built a tower and he leased it to tenants and went into another country. And when the season came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard. And they took him and they beat him and they sent him away empty-handed. And again he sent to them another servant, and they struck him on the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and they killed him. And with so many others they beat him, and so with many others, some they beat, some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally he sent them to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him and threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. And have you not read the scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. All right, so if you weren't with me when we were talking about cleansing the temple and maybe what the meaning was there, I think this parable is pretty straightforward, actually. And I think his audience understood what he was saying. Jesus is telling a story about Israel and their treatment and rejection of the prophets, and ultimately their treatment and rejection of the Son. So this is a story that doesn't have a happy ending for the tenants. How does it end? He asks them, what would you do? Like, what would the owner do in this situation? When he even sends his son and they kill his son. He says, well, they would destroy the tenants and give the vineyard to others. That's not hard to understand. So I think this story dovetails exactly into what he did in the temple earlier, but also the riddle he just asked them about John the Baptist. Because with John, remember, John was the last. He's the last of the prophets. And then comes the Son. So this is exactly what's happening in this parable. So Jesus is at the end. He's the last of the prophetic line, but finally God has sent his Son. And his Son has now come to Jerusalem, where he is about to be rejected and killed. Another interesting thing about this, I think a lot of what's happening in these chapters, you just can't get the full meaning unless you look back to the Old Testament references. This parable is very, very close to what Isaiah tells in Isaiah chapter 5. He has a very similar parable. If you look in Isaiah 5, verses 1 through 7, here's what Isaiah said. The story is very similar. It says, "Let me sing for my beloved my love song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it, cleared it of stones, and he planted with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a wine vat in it. And he looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, O inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled." Okay, so here, the owner is God. The vineyard is Israel. God's planted it. He's put a hedge around it. He's built a tower there. And he comes looking for its fruit, but it didn't produce the fruit. And so what does God do? It says, I'll remove its hedge. It will be devoured. I'll break down its wall. It will be trampled down. An interesting thing about the way Jesus retells this parable from Isaiah is he doesn't mention the stone. In Isaiah it says, we'll remove the stones, and he leaves that part out. But then at the end of this parable, all of a sudden he's talking about a stone. So here in Mark 12, he gets to the end of it, and he says, haven't you read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. This was the Lord's doing, and it's marvelous in our eyes. So he leaves out the stone in the story about Isaiah, but he gets to a more important stone at the end, and he invokes Psalm 118. So again, this psalm, we talked about this psalm with the triumphal entry. This psalm was sung at Passover time, sung while you're going up to the temple. The psalm has a lot to do with the temple. But here, Jesus is talking about himself, the fact that he'll be rejected, but that the stone that's rejected is the chief cornerstone. In chapter 13, the disciples are going to say, look at this marvelous building. And Jesus is going to talk about the stones of the temple and the stones of the city. And there won't be one left on top of each other. But here he's talking about himself as a stone, as the most important stone, as the capstone or the cornerstone. Jesus is doing something lasting. Jesus is God's stone that the builders reject. But it's in fact a stone that's lasting and eternal and marvelous in our eyes, it says in the psalm. So those are my thoughts on this parable. Any comments or questions? Brother Goebel? Get the mic up here in a minute.
Actually wanted to make a comment about the Pharisees talking to Jesus about the baptism of John or asking about authority and him referencing to that. I take a couple of things from that. When he asked him the baptism of John, for what authority was that? The Pharisees' thinking is right. I mean, when you think of religious matters, there's only two possible places for authority. It's God or man, right? And only one's legitimate. God's the only legitimate one. So they're reasoning through that, and they think to themselves, because what that tells me is that John, being a prophet, is proclaiming the message of God. God's expectation to the people in Judea where this message was preached that they were going to submit themselves to John's baptism, I think. And so as they reasoned through it, why do they say that they didn't do it? They said, he'll say, why didn't you believe him? Not why didn't you obey him? Why didn't you believe him? And I think that kind of foreshadows as we get to Mark 16:16, which I'm not skipping too far ahead, but when he says, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, he that believes not shall be condemned. We hear so many people in the religious world say, he didn't say anything about not being baptized, so therefore baptism must not be part of it. But if you take it from their reasoning when they're saying, well, we didn't do it because we didn't believe John. So it's kind of foreshadowing that Jesus is bringing this to them, and he mentions that message because just here we get over into Acts 2, the message is going to be proclaimed, and who's not going to do it? The chief priests and the elders. They still don't believe the message from God. So there's no reason in Mark 16 that he has to say that he that does not believe and is not baptized shall be saved. It's obvious. If you're not submitting yourself to what God's asked you to do, you don't believe him. And I think that's it just kind of tying all that together with what they say versus what's going to be preached here in a few, short time, and then even up to the modern era where people still continue to deny that God has asked them to submit themselves to baptism.
It's a very good comment. Yeah, and I think you don't even have to look as far ahead as Mark 16 to get the gist of not believing God's prophet, right? Because that's the point of this whole parable, that God has sent his prophets. He sent his servants to the vineyard to collect the fruit, to collect belief, right? What kind of fruit are we talking about? We're talking about faith in God and belief. And there's none to collect when they come. They don't believe, and so I think we get that sense of God's prophets are being rejected. Likewise, the Pharisees, they don't believe. They don't believe in John the Baptist. But many do, and that's why they're afraid politically, right? Because if they do say it's from God, or if they don't say it's from God, if they say it's not from God, if they announce their disbelief, well, there's many followers there with Jesus who have come into Jerusalem with Jesus as their Messiah, as the one who follows John the Baptist, and they believe. And so it's politically risky for them to say John's not from heaven. Sister Walton?
Well, it shows that their motives were evil from the very beginning, because they're skating on awfully thin ice right now, because Jesus has just given them quotations out of Isaiah and Jeremiah that of all people they should have been familiar with, because that's what they studied. And they had to have known that he's quoting what we already know is true. And they are running out of excuses, and they can't answer questions now, because either way, they're doomed either way. And so the fact that they won't answer shows the true state of their heart, and they're not going to.
That's a great comment. Leads right into verse 12 in chapter 12. They understood. It says they were seeking to arrest him, but they feared the people, for they perceived that Jesus had told this parable against them. They knew. They know Scripture. They know Jesus is reading out of Isaiah 5. They know this story comes from there. They know God's message from Isaiah 5. And it says they perceived that it was said against them. So, they knew. I agree with that 100%. So this idea, they're trying to trap him. They're seeking to arrest him. We get that here. And there's a sort of a series of questions and tests that get posed to Jesus here. First of which is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar? So that's what we're going to talk about here for the remainder of our time. And then there's two more. The Sadducees come and they ask him a question about the resurrection. Remember, Sadducees, they don't believe in a bodily resurrection. And then the third is there's a scribe or a temple official that asks him, what's the most important commandment? But I do want to focus on this first question here. This question about paying taxes. So it says they sent to him some of the Pharisees. They're trying to trap him. Some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. And they came to him and they said, "Teacher, we know that you are true and don't care about anyone's opinion. For you're not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not?" But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius and let me look at it." And they brought one, and he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. All right, so a couple things to think about here in the last couple minutes of our class. That right there is an image of, of a tribute coin from this time. I believe that's Tiberius. There's an inscription on it. Jesus asked for one of these. He says, "Give it to me. Let me see the denarius." And he says, "Whose picture is on it?" Well, it has a picture of Tiberius, the emperor. And whose inscription? Well, it has an inscription on the coin that says, "Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus," or Tiberius, son of a god, basically. And I think the coin itself gives us a little insight into actually what the trap was or what the controversy is here. They are asking about paying about taxes, which would be very unpopular with the Jewish people. They don't like paying taxes to a Gentile nation, of course. The Herodians are asking him this. They're itching. They say, "We know you're no respecter of persons," meaning we know you'll speak out even if it's against Caesar, because you're not the kind of person to respect positions and titles. You're going to speak the truth. So they're basically baiting him or daring him to say something against the emperor. And I think that's their hope for trapping him, either to say something against the emperor or to say something unpopular with his followers that's going to cost him. But the coin is interesting. I think part of the controversy about the taxes is if you're a Jew and you're following sort of the strict Jewish teaching about idolatry, this is blasphemous, or it's potentially blasphemous. It's a graven image on a coin. It's calling him the son of a god. It's potentially blasphemous. I think even the coinage itself was controversial. So Jesus asked for it. And I think part of the interesting thing is Jesus sort of puts them on the spot. He says, "Give me a coin." And oh, guess what? One of these people that tested him actually has one of these potentially blasphemous coins in his possession. So he says, "Well, you have it." And he says, "Well, whose image is on it?" So we just talked about how the image is Tiberius, and the inscription says "Son of a God." But Jesus' answer is, well, render to Caesar what is Caesar's, but give to God what is God's. So what's he saying here? Keep in mind he's talking about an image and an inscription. So if we go back to the law, what's the image? And what's God's? What's God's image? So again, they ask him a legal question, so he goes to the Torah. He goes to the first 5 books of the Bible. And he's asking them to think about an image and an inscription. Well, an image, we would know, we're created in the image of God. So God said, "Let us make man in our image." What's God's image? It's the whole of the person. It's man. And what's God's inscription? We look in Exodus 13, he's talking about his law. He says, "I'm writing the law on you. My inscription is on you. It's on your eyes, and it's on your hands, and it's in your mouth." God's law, God's inscription is on you. So when he says, "Render unto God what is God's," that's the whole self. His answer is, give your whole self to God. Yes, there's a sense in which it's, yes, pay Caesar back with his idolatrous coin. Give that back to him. But give God everything, right? And so they're looking for either a treasonous answer, a revolutionary answer, or something that would upset them and just say, "Give this to Caesar." But what Jesus is saying here is the real revolution doesn't have to do with paying taxes or not paying taxes. It's total obedience to God the Father himself, being who God created you to be. So that's a good place to leave off. I want to thank everyone for their participation.